Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of This Valorant Life. Join Adam and myself as we dive into the major reasons players get hard stuck or plateau in their gameplay. Join us as we explore different archetypes of players and how their mindsets affect their performance. From passive players to overthinkers to those with too big of an ego, we unravel the secrets on how to overcome this. And with that, let's get into it. Welcome to episode 5 of This Valorant Life. I'm here with my friend Adam Dopai, and we are going to be jumping into what are the major reasons players get hard stuck or they plateau, and then also what are the reasons for and the archetypes for different players and why they get stuck. So with that, Adam, what's your thinking on why do certain players or what are the major pitfalls that players get hard stuck or plateau?
There's a lot of them, but I think one of the most common ones is that people plateau simply because they don't take enough risk, right? Like they're scared of losing. They play really passive. Like you can see this mainly with controller players, sentinel players, but just because the roles are kind of divvied up into 4, right? You have controller, sentinel, initiator, and duelist. 3 out of 4 of those are support agents, right? So that means that, 75% of players arbitrarily are going to be passive players just because their kit kind of favors that, right? And I find that a lot of people struggle to play outside of their kit or know when to take risk when their kit doesn't directly help them do that, unlike duelists, right? And then, of course, some duelists are too passive for sure, but that's definitely one of the more common ones. And maybe it's like a confidence thing as well. It's, I don't want to be the first one in, or I don't want to be the person getting first contact and things like that. So I would say that's definitely number one most common.
So they're too passive. And how does that affect their gameplay that holds them back or causes them to plateau?
So the plateauing part directly, I would say, is they get to the point to where their game sense and decision making stops them. And then everything, their wins and losses now depend on their duelist and their teammates taking risk to offset their impact. So they're like at a stable baseline. Oh, I'm passive. I'm doing the quote unquote right thing. I'm not taking too much risk. I'm doing my job. And then if you play like this every single game, your outcome of the game is going to depend on your teammates. And this is super important for sure.
So they basically kind of become passengers by playing in like a fashion where they don't lose the game. They've kind of risen to a certain level, but then now it's just basically RNG. Sometimes they'll get good teammates and then they're going to carry them. And sometimes they get bad teammates and they'll pull them down. But fundamentally, like they're not stirring the drink. Like they have very little effect on the game because they take no risk.
Exactly.
And so these are the guys that would generally like just try to play setups and not try to do anything active, which I think we've talked about this before, which is like the sentinel role at a pro level. And in some of this translates to a casual level too, is you have to be able to anchor primarily off of gun skills sometimes. And that's one thing they probably can't do if they're not taking any risk.
Exactly. And it also kind of makes our job a little bit harder. So going off of the sentinel thing, if you just let the enemies walk into your site and break all your util and then re-hit and you have nothing, you're going to lose, right? But if you're playing a little bit more aggressive to break their util and bait out util and then fall back into your setup, you have a much easier time of actually playing off of your util there.
Maybe let me ask you, maybe that's a broader question. Like how common is playing not to lose?
Super common. If I was going to put a number on it, I'd probably say 90% of players play not to lose. Like just from my experience and from the VODs I've seen, not a lot of people are like active, making calls, trying to make plays to win. They're kind of just like going with the flow and autopiloting and things like that. So super common.
And so how do you switch that, I guess, mindset from playing not to lose to trying to play to win?
What helps for me is kind of like defining how much control I have. So I always try to get as much control over the game as I can, right? That's why I like to play duelist. I like to get first contact. I like to IGL, pre-round calm for my teammates. I like to, coordinate plays in the mid-round and the post-plant. Like I want to have as much control as possible and leverage that. And I think if you think about how much control you do have and how much you can have, bridging that gap is super important.
And so that's if you play like a duelist role. How do you have a more play to win play style in the other roles, like controller, especially controller and sentinel? What does that look like?
You have to get info somehow. So with controllers and sentinels, most commonly to playing to not lose, you're kind of just throwing smokes for teammates or doing a very passive setup to get info across the map. If you're playing to kind of win, you have to take some risk. So for a controller, that might mean, being a little bit closer to the barriers and jiggling for info. Or if you're playing Sentinel, you might use, aggressive setups to get information early on. So for Cypher, you might early camera. For Killjoy, you might use an aggressive turret to control, let's say, B main on Ascent, a very aggressive turret to kind of fight off of it. And then I guess maybe another example for controllers would be like after you use your util, you can kind of free yourself up to just take duels.
And what are other reasons or other kind of concepts? Why do players get plateau or why do they get hard stuck?
I would say other players, and I would say I fit into one of these, is you kind of over obsess over something that's not important. In my case, and I think there are a lot of people like me that over obsess over aim and mechanics. You're kind of like trying to max your level out in one area, but then you have like this weak level here and you're super bottlenecked, right? And you're not going to get any better if you're not going to level up this bottleneck because, that's just going to bring you down essentially. And most commonly, like players like this and players like me typically play duelist and they typically overthink a lot. That's probably the best characteristic, is just overthinkers.
But when you over focus on that one thing, what does it get in the way of? If you're super hyper focused on aim and mechanics, what is it taking away from that would be beneficial for you to spend time on? What are the other things that you need to think about?
There's a lot. I would say it kind of just is a very easy cope. Be like, oh, I lost this round because my mechanics suck. When in reality, it could be lack of utility usage, bad positioning. Maybe you didn't reposition in the first place. Maybe you could have coordinated a play with your teammate. Just literally the list goes on and on. But if you just aim cope and expect to win 100% of your gun duels, you're just going to use that as an excuse every single time and not understand why you actually lost that round.
And so by focusing on that one thing, it's scratching this itch of you want it to be simple, but really the answer is almost super complex, which is that if you pull back the decision tree, was it your pre-rounding? Was it your eco? Was it being unaware of ultimates? Was it, playing with your teammates? And that's where I think it's been supportive for people to work with you, because sometimes it's hard for players when they VOD review to understand what the actual mistake is. I don't know. What's your experience with players? Are they able to, do they focus on just like the gun duel, or are they sometimes able to see the reason behind that?
It's definitely a lot more rare that a player can unpack it to 5 decision trees back, like you said. It's almost always what's in their face. Like, I could have won this duel maybe by taking a different step this way or PMing better. And it's just like, is that duel even a good one in the first place?
Yeah.
Why are you even on the side of the map?
Yeah.
Like why you last alive, things like that. So like those questions, so where you're not even in that predicament in the first place, I would say is the most important. And I don't think a lot of people see that.
So I have a question for you, and you can agree or disagree. So I feel, one thing I've learned a lot in life as a general life skill is if you never make a guess or put forth a hypothesis, you can never see if it's wrong. And I think most players play the game without a hypothesis. They don't have an idea that they're testing. And so then they're just basing it on the gun duel. And the reason I say this is I'm trying to like create playbooks for myself from ZTOL, playing Fate on different maps. And like 30% of the time, like he's rotating with the hand behind his head and just like WSASD. And it's because, so his thesis is, I just want to be at the fights. That is like the most important thing. And that's what I'm noticing. And do you see players, one, does that make sense? Do you agree? Do you need to pick a hypothesis and actually test it, have an idea and try it out?
I think so, 100%. And with the ZTOL example, because it's solo queue, he's just trying to be as active as possible. And like you said, he's just looking for gun duels. That's his thesis. And that's typically, the thesis for most high-level players that have good mechanics.
Yeah, they just want to be there.
Yeah, they just want.
But so do you find players doing that? Do they have something they're testing? And if not, how do they start incorporating this?
Most players, I don't think, have that. I mean, they probably just play to play. I guess like to start with that, maybe I would think about agent mastery first. So like the hypothesis or thing or thesis here would be like, how much can I get out of my kit?
Hmm.
and just thinking about that every single round. If you can,
Hmm.
util, like you use your whole util in your kit and like actually see how much value you can get out of it, I think that's a good place to start.
Hmm.
Because then you can
Hmm.
be like, oh, this flash did this. Was it actually useful? And then you kind of
Hmm.
go from there.
I've been noticing this on Fade because I think depending on your offense or defense, actually, I think his util or her rather, her util flips, right? I feel like on offense, the Prowler is so important and the Haunt can almost be like you just for info. But
Hmm.
then on defense, I feel like you almost want to use the Prowlers for or the dogs for info and the Haunts for like at the site hit because it causes the most chaos.
I definitely agree with that.
Does that kind of switch on offense defense happen with other characters you've seen or other agents?
Maybe for initiators specifically,
Hmm.
like you said, recon initiators kind of share that like idea, like your
That
dark,
playstyle?
yeah, that play style. For flash agents, I think it's a little bit kind of similar to like on offense, you kind of use your flash to get map control. It's okay
Hmm.
to just waste it. But if you
Hmm.
use your flash for fun on defense, then they just wait it out. And then when they hit your site, you lose. Sometimes it's
Hmm.
better to keep your flash for the hit and things like that.
Hmm.
And I don't know where I got this term from, but I've been using it a lot to describe wasted util as like for fun util. I will see a lot of people just throw util for fun. And that's really detrimental for defense
Yes.
because if you're using for fun util and then they come hit your site and there's three people there and you're one player, you're just going to lose.
Yeah.
I definitely feel like that's a big flip because like on offense, you can just brute force the site and your util with numbers, right?
Hmm.
Like the sheer amount of
Hmm.
util you're flying into the site or, you're double swinging or triple swinging. It doesn't really matter if you waste your util because then even if you
Hmm.
get to the post plant, you can just set up a crossfire. But on
Hmm.
defense, unless you're five stacked on a site, you
Hmm.
need to be a little bit more conscious over your
Mm.
kit.
Okay. Are there any other reasons that come to mind for you that players get hard stuck or they plateau?
The first thing that came to mind when you said that was like people kind of treat Valorant as like a side hobby, but
Hmm.
also put a little bit too much emphasis on their identity. So it's like
Okay.
a mix of like, oh, this is for fun, but I really want to get to a high rank, and then they start tilting, right?
Mm.
So it's like kind of understanding that balance of am I trying to get better or is like my whole identity tied to my rank? And
Mm.
a few people come in mind with this one, but I know this is very true for myself. Like growing up playing League of Legends, for some reason I was like, oh my God, like I'm diamond, I'm really good at the game. And
Yeah.
as a result, once I got there, I kind of stopped looking to improve. I guess in simple terms,
Mm.
it's like I developed an ego, right? And like people that have egos are going to be a lot more, I guess, it's a lot harder for them to grow because
Hmm.
they're like fighting different people's opinions. And I think that's, you know, super true for Valorant.
Hmm.
The amount of egos in Valorant is insane. Someone will get Ascendant, yo, I'm the best in the world. Someone gets to Immortal, I'm even better than the best in the world. I
Yeah.
can go pro.
Yeah.
And in reality, until you're like, I don't know, top 50 Radiant,
Yeah.
you're probably not even close to understanding what the actual game is
What
like.
would what's the gap between someone in Diamond to Immortal?
It's pretty massive.
Pretty massive.
Yeah.
What about the gap between Immortal 1, the bottom of Immortal, to Radiant?
Oh
Is it
my
even
God.
bigger?
It's bigger. The
It's
gap
bigger.
between Immortal 3 and Radiant is probably the same size from Diamond to Immortal. Arbitrarily, of course,
Hmm.
but I think like climb from Immortal 3 to Radiant is really hard. And then once you hit Radiant, like the gap inside Radiant is just massive because
Is it? So what's the and I mean, what would be an example of the difference between a player that just is just hovering around Radiant slash Immortal, like bumping in and out, and someone in the top 100?
okay, so this one's interesting, but it's the accuracy, I think. It's the accuracy of your decisions.
Okay.
So players in the top 100 consistently
Hmm.
always like consistently know what the best play is and they try to
Hmm.
execute on that. Whereas
Hmm.
like players that are kind of in and out of Immortal or sorry, Radiant, they kind of make good plays sometimes, but it's
Hmm.
like maybe random or it's 50-50 or they're not conscious of their decisions. So it's, they can't like employ that every single time. And it also could
Hmm.
just be a lack of experience. They
Hmm.
don't know what right play is. But I would say that's probably the most important. If you look For example, at, I don't know, Zekin, he's ended rank 1, I want to say 5 times,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you watch him play, of course his aim is great. Of course his comms are great. But I think what's maybe even more impressive is like he knows when to make a play and then when to bait on duelist and like when to lurk on duelist. Like he almost always has impact in a round. Is
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's what it distills
Mm-hmm.
down to, is like, how to get impact every single round or most
Mm-hmm.
rounds.
And would you say then what percentage of that difference between a top 50 radiant and a barely radiant is gun skills? Is it a significant difference in gun skills, or is it mostly a difference in pattern recognition and decision making?
Definitely the second. I would
Mm.
say gun skill wise, you probably can find some people in Immortal 1 or 2 with nearly as good gun skill as
Mm-hmm.
someone that maybe is a pro player or in Radiant. And I think one of the reasons for this, and I'm not sure if other pros would agree with me, but Zekin was in a Sentinels podcast recently. He said something along the lines of these ranked demons have the aim threshold and the mechanics threshold of pro level players, but they're not there because their decision making is terrible. And even
Mm-hmm.
if you look in the tier 2 to tier 3 scene with
Mm-hmm.
tournaments like Knights and things like that, just watching the games, like the decision making between that and VCT is so much different.
Mm-hmm.
So
And so
I
people think that the gun skills is like the holy grail, but I think what we're talking about at this level is that the gun skills are relatively similar. It's actually that it's hard to teach the decision making.
would say
And
that's
this is what
completely
I would
true.
put forward is it's almost like the decision making allows you to consistently be in good positions.
To leverage.
Whereas, yeah, to leverage it. Whereas if you're not making good decisions, you're fighting from positions of disadvantage because of things you did 10, 15, 30 seconds before.
Exactly. I
Mhm.
think that's very accurate. And I guess like this begs the question, like, is that the gap in the focus for lower ranked players? Like, if these
Mm.
players can get to Radiant or Immortal 3 with, high level mechanics but bad decision making, should everyone be focusing on mechanics? And, I think a lot of people make that argument, myself included, for a long time. And there's a lot of people that cope that way. But I think like maybe the better way of thinking about it is mechanics is something that you can't just get overnight. Even if you train mechanics consistently, you will grow quicker decision making wise in game sense if you focus on that, because you
Mhm.
can't just level up your mechanics every single time, but you
Mhm.
can learn more about the game and apply that nearly instantaneously. So the ideal player that's trying to
Mhm.
improve or go pro at any stage should be training their mechanics daily, but then they should also be spending a significant amount of time refining their decision making process,
Mhm.
utility usage, game sense, just that whole bucket, communication. The amount of people that I look at that don't talk is pretty insane.
We have to come up with a term for this. I feel like there's the reason people don't talk most of the time. Okay, and we have to name this player. We have to
Okay.
create a name for it. The player that only talks at the end of the game and calls his teammates like complete trash. That's the only time they use their mic. We have to have a name for it. I don't. Maybe we'll think about a name later. But like, what is the reason you think that players like don't calm?
I've asked a few of these players myself because like I've tried to get them to calm. It
Mhm.
ranges from being too shy to thinking that they're so much better that they don't need to calm, to
Mm,
thinking that it's just a game. I just want to enjoy myself and just
mm,
vibe. Maybe they're
mm,
scrolling on TikTok or whatever. There's a whole different range there, but maybe ultimately it's like they don't really think their comms are as important as they should be, or they're not taking the game seriously enough. So they think that they can leverage other parts of their gameplay and
mm. To make
cover
up
the
for it.
lack of comms. Exactly.
I wonder if it's something like I remember I've read some YouTube stuff where people like won't start YouTube stuff if they want to because they're afraid of what all their friends would think. And the reality is like nobody notices. And I feel like it's similar with calming and pre-rounding in games when you're like, hey, can I call a strat? Da, da, da. Even if it doesn't work, even if people don't listen to you, no one really cares. But it like for that person, I feel like psychologically it feels like a big deal.
I think that's true. I mean, even for me, like when I play games now and I make a call and we're losing, I'm just like, like that was probably my fault. Or like, this is something that I still, I guess, maybe struggle with now is like if there are known people on my team I won't make like very precise calls. I'll just be like, hey, can we go this side? It's
Yeah.
weak. Implying we do something, especially with streamers or pros. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want to sound or feel too maybe
Prescriptive.
yes. And especially if there's a pro on my team, I'm like, okay, well, if I call this strat and he thinks it's dumb, he's not going to do it,
Yeah.
And like most of the time, there's like no conversation back and forth because either they're talking to chat or they're just playing ranked to get mechanical reps
Yeah.
in. In a sense, like I get egoed, which kind of just means that I don't really want to call anymore. And this happens all the time. Like anytime there's like duo of like streamers or pros, I just like try to calm a little bit, and then as the game progresses, like it's less and less to the point I'm no calming. And I think like, people have a similar experience with that.
I feel, and it's hard. It sounds really easy, but it's like way harder to do than it actually sounds. Which is, I think Hooch's VOD requirement is that you pre-round every round. That's legitimately, like that meme. It's challenge impossible. Calm every pre-round every round. It's actively hard sometimes. It's actively way harder than you think it is.
I think so.
You can barely get people to save and buy at the same time, let alone have a pre-round. Maybe with that, we'll move into what are the common archetypes you see in players, and how does that hold them back?
So we've kind of touched on a few of them already. I would say like being overly passive is one. So like if I were to put a character trait on this, it's probably just being shy and like risk averse. And then you have, the overthinkers like me, and then that kind of like, makes you overly obsessive in the wrong areas. And then you also have players that have the egos, they like are really good mechanically normally because like trying to, live up to their ego, but they're really hard to work with. So like, these are the people that don't calm, no teamwork.
Yeah, I feel like the ego guy is also the guy that's like passive aggressive. Like when someone makes a play, they'll just be like, "Why are we doing this?" And whenever I hear that guy, I'm like, "Man, you're actually probably like maybe 200 RR below your actual level because you are a complete vibe killer. Like you just take your team and you just suck the life out of it."
They're like hindsight Harrys too, and like it's rough. So I would say those are probably the three most common ones: overthinkers, egos, and then passive players. I guess like if you were to throw in maybe a fourth one, it would just be people who don't take the game super seriously. Like maybe they're like super, chill people, and they whatever, but they're just like, I'm playing for fun. That's like your casual, probably.
I feel like the really passive ones are also the ones that will tell you just don't peek. As in, like, we can win this tactical FPS by never taking a gunfight. Yeah.
And it works sometimes, but it's not a high conversion rate. Or like if it is, it's accidental.
30% of the time it works every time.
True.
Well, cool. Is there anything else that comes to mind? Any topics that we didn't cover, you think?
I guess we can go into maybe like what each archetype can work on.
Sure. Yeah. Let's do it.
Arbitrarily, the person with the ego needs to get some more social skills. So how do you go about getting social skills? You probably stop playing the game.
No, I think the ego one is, there's always a thing under the thing, right? So that person has an ego partly because they're insecure. There's a Chinese saying, I'm going to mess it up, but like the person who says they have a lot of money don't have a lot of money. And the people who say nothing probably do, right? And the person with the ego is actually in their own way coping. And so part of it is recognizing that. And two, I think having the reality check that if you were really good, well, you wouldn't actually be at this rank. You would actually be at an even higher rank. I don't know. That's what comes to mind for me.
I would say that's pretty accurate. I would say like I'm one of those players that had an ego. Just to give a little bit of backstory, I definitely went through like a rank demon, no calm phase, ego. I'm better than everyone. And as a result, I think what kind of brought me out of that is understanding, first of all, I wasn't good enough to go pro. So that was like a humility check, humble check, whatever. And two, that it didn't serve me at all to do that. It was like, I'm just wasting my time, no calming. Like, why am I playing this game? And like just the fact that I was wasting my time outweighed my ego, like in any form. I was just like, okay, if I'm going to do this, like throw the ego aside and just play to learn, play to improve. And I think that helped me kind of get to where I am now. Definitely not perfect, but like taking that step, like, if I have this ego, like at least understand like to get better as a player, I need to throw it away. Or I
Mm-hmm.
need to take the importance of not wasting my time, because
Mm-hmm.
I think, like you said, with the egos, like there's a big insecurity thing there.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why, at least for me, is like I want to be good. I want to be really good. And I'm not getting better by having the ego. So hopefully that kind of made sense.
Mm-hmm. No, that totally makes sense. I think I was reading this thing recently, and they were just talking about how really top performers, like they know they need to improve. And I think maybe reframing the ego from being needing the results and needing to feel superior to other people to feel okay. The really top performers, they actually just have a really strong belief in their abilities or like their prep. I believe that I've worked harder than everyone else. Or based on these results, I believe in these skills. But it's never useful to like over index where it's that belief in yourself becomes its own kind of burden if it means that you're too cool to try.
I think you hit it right there, and there's a lot of things that come to mind there. But like, the whole training part, like you said, like it's too cool to try. Like, I think that really puts it there. It's like these people have such high egos when they play that they don't want to try, because if they try and lose, it's like, damage to their
Mm-hmm.
self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like with the preparation thing, I forget where I heard this from, but like nervousness and excitement is like really similar. But to bridge the gap between nervousness and excitement, it's just preparation, right? Like if you feel like you put a lot of preparation and you can trust that,
Mm-hmm.
for example, going into a match, if
Mm-hmm.
you practice every single day, you reviewed your gameplay, there's nothing else you could have done, you're going to be excited for the match. But if
Mm-hmm.
you know that you left some on the table, you're going to be
Mm-hmm.
nervous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is the exact example around the growth mindset and kids in school, right? Which is if you tell a kid they're smart and they start to do worse, they will actively choose not to try to save their ego because they don't want to try and fail and then not be smart. And so it's really just about focusing on effort.
Effort. I mean, that's all it boils down to. And how do you put in effort? You got to start training.
Mhm,
Some people think they're
mhm,
too cool to aim train, or
mhm,
like, oh, it's too much work when they queue 15 games a day,
mhm,
or it's just like you could queue one less game a day and do some
mhm,
aim training, or you could queue two less games a day and do some VOD review.
mhm,
But doing that is just too much work. So
mhm, mhm.
putting some effort into that would be big.
What about so that's the ego player. What is the thing the Sentinel, like the passive player, what can they incorporate in their game style or their gameplay to kind of work on this?
Two things come to mind for me. One is trying to take more risk in general. So kind of just be okay with losing, probably is the first one. If you can go and lose 20 games straight, you're probably okay. You're going to get it back eventually. But if you do lose those 20 games straight and you can climb back, the fact that you've gone through that will mean that you're a little bit, you have tougher skin against
Mm-hmm.
losses,
Mm-hmm.
right? So going through that first is probably a big thing. And like that's kind of like where ranked anxiety derives from, is
Mm-hmm.
like people just don't play enough, so they don't build up the tough skin for the RR points.
Mm-hmm.
And then like to go off of this, like with the risk taking, I find, at least for me, I feel a lot more comfortable taking risk when I've put in time beforehand. So for me, that's warming up or aim training, or if it's like a map I'm really uncomfortable with, I'm not going to do anything crazy. But if I like
Sure.
put in the prep time beforehand, like, oh, if there's no one here off of my boombot, I'm going to do this rotate and take this fight. Like I've thought about that beforehand. It's not even really taking a risk. It's just
Mm-hmm.
following through with the plan. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess this kind of brings in a few things for these type of passive players, is bring in some prep beforehand so you can kind of just
Mm-hmm.
execute your plan,
Mm-hmm.
and then warming up maybe a little bit more intensively if they don't already do that.
Oh, well, I think maybe to extend on that, a big part of it is thinking about creating that playbook for yourself and then just executing it. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not that you're going to win every game, but at least over 5, 10, 15 games, if you execute on your playbook and it's not working, well, then you can fix something. That's your common thread, right?
100%.
Or
And
you can actually do things that are outside of your comfort zone because it's in your.
exactly. And
Yeah.
just to kind of like touch on the playbook thing, it is also kind of a double-edged sword. Like
Okay.
you will then only use your playbook, and then there's no creativeness outside of it, and you're just
Mhm.
stuck on that. So either you get a super complex playbook, which doesn't exist because Valorant isn't super flowchartable, but just use your playbook more as a guideline, and
Mhm.
then you build off of it in like, each game
Mhm.
rather than
Mhm.
sticking to it like, you know, like it's the Bible or whatever.
Mhm. Mhm. So what was the third archetype?
Yeah, passive, we had ego. Oh, overthinkers.
Overthinkers. Okay.
Okay, so for
What can
this
the
one,
overthinkers do?
since they overthink so much, I think like writing out or thinking about writing is probably best, like
Mm.
what their strengths and weaknesses are.
Mhm.
And this is really useful. I recently worked with a performance coach, kind of helped me with this. So
Mhm.
if you outline your strengths, first of all, that helps you instill confidence in yourself.
Mhm.
So for me, I know I'm really good at taking fights and
Mhm.
I'm not scared to take them, right? If that's my strength, then I can kind of like leverage that confidence to take a fight when it feels like I need to make a play.
Mhm.
But like one of my weaknesses, I would say, is I tilt, somewhat quickly, especially if I feel like I made a bad play. Okay, so if I outline that as my weakness, the mental game, that means all I have to do when I play the game is focus on my mental. I have tools for that, breathing or, not insta queuing right after a game or just limiting my
Mhm.
games, which I've done for a while now, like, helps me kind of stop the tilt or limit the damage control that it can do. So, outlining those strengths and weaknesses, I think, are going to be huge for these overthinkers. I guess as an example, like someone opposite of me that's maybe overthinking is like, oh, I need to make the perfect play and play with my teammates all the time. And if I don't make the best play possible, the smartest play, like I'm going to lose. And I
Mhm.
think that's kind of the opposite of me is like, I will make plays alone, but they won't make plays or if they're not alone. So if they can kind of outline that as their strength, is like, okay, I work really well with my teammates. Let me, make pre-round plans and make,
Mhm.
all that stuff. And then also like my teammates aren't being receptive, try to make plays myself. And like, you can try making tools for that or making a playbook around that. But I think, simply put, outlining your strengths, outlining your weaknesses just to bring awareness to it,
Mhm.
and then see if you can take any actionable steps from there. But that one
Well,
varies a lot.
I even heard within there it was outlining your strengths, outlining your weaknesses, and then thinking ahead. Like, how are your weaknesses going to come up in the game? And thinking about, if this happens, then I will do this. And that's
Hmm.
like way easier to do than in the moment trying to deal with your tilt. Like, you've already
Hmm.
decided how you're going to deal with your tilt.
Yeah, and just an example, like let's say I lose a clutch. Almost
Hmm.
immediately, my instinct reaction is, damn, I could have won that, I could have done X, Y, Z.
Hmm. Hmm.
But, instead of having that gut reaction, like instead I try to catch myself and then take my deep breaths or catch myself
Hmm.
and then just stop any words from coming out. Just be
Mm.
like, maybe I'll sigh or maybe I'll just breathe and then sigh, whatever.
Hmm. Hmm.
But just interrupting that because I know it's going to happen. If I lose
Hmm.
a clutch, I'm definitely going to get frustrated. But yeah, just stopping that action because you already know it's coming. So like you said, preparing for it, I think is really good.
The last thing that comes to mind for me, and because I think I fall in this category, is like players that are too rigid.
Mm.
In my mind, I like these hard and fast rules of you don't peek in a man up situation. And then I think I hone in on these too much, even when it actively is detracting from my playstyle or like the ability to win games. And so I think I love your opinion on this. I feel like for me, part of it is you have these rules, these concepts that you're trying to apply, but you also have to trust yourself. Trust your judgment and your instincts. Because if you can't trust yourself, if you're just trusting what you think someone else says is right, that's going to be like a really hard way to learn the game.
Yeah, a lot of things come to mind here, but I guess I'll reference Inner Game of Tennis here. I believe like the way they hit a swing eventually changed throughout the years because of these rules and guidelines and based off of a pro's intuition and they made that adjustment and it then became accepted. But I guess like this is kind of where it comes for me is like all of these rules and guidelines that we're saying, like me as a coach and other coaches are saying, aren't set in stone. Like maybe 5 years down the road, it's going to be completely different. Like
Mhm.
just a thing that off the top of my head, like if you're in a 2v1 and one player has contact, player A has contact, player B swings off of player A's contact, right?
Mhm.
That's like the most common rule. But if the enemy player knows that rule exists, he's going to bait out player one's shot and then tuck back into cover to isolate the fight on the guy that player B that's going
Mm.
to swing you.
Mm.
And
Mm.
this is super common, right? You bait out the guy to swing you in the crossfire. And, you know, if you trust your intuition that the guy might be doing that or he's capable of doing that, you don't swing on the first contact. You bait a little bit
Mm.
harder. And
Mm.
that's why I think these rules are one, it makes
Mm.
you super predictable, right?
Yes.
And two is like there's so much nuance to it because the enemy team is going to predict you, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. So
It gets into like kind of rock, paper, scissors.
Exactly. So yeah, definitely don't treat them as rules. We know nothing. We just assume, but it's like guidelines. Yeah.
Well, with that, we'll wrap it up this week. Until next time, thank you, Adam, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks for listening in.
Thanks for listening.